I was just saying I'd like to start with greetings of peace. And I said that it's become a sort of truism that, is overused, that Islam and peace. So I just thought I'd still start with it. And I'd like to just take around the next 30 to 35 minutes to speak to you about a few thoughts. When I was invited to give this talk, because of how busy I am with the work at the Faculty of Divinity, I was reluctant at first. I just don't like to commit to something that I can't give my entire consciousness to. But anyway, when I was able to do it, and I agreed, a generic title was given because I couldn't suggest anything, and so it was the essence of Islam. And I just feel it's just a comprehensive, I'd rather it had no title because then wouldn't be much expectation. So, but being finite, at least one thing I know for sure about myself, I don't think I would have ever been able to give the comprehensiveness of this title its due worth anyway. So let's just try and capture a little bit of the essence of Islam. I'd like to start by talking about religion's purpose. I feel that we live in a world where religion has, I think anomalously almost, and compared to 99% of human history, been recognized as potentially a force for evil. I don't think that if we went back 1,000 years, religious people certainly have always done evil, but just the idea, and it goes back to Cain and Abel for those who believe in that, but nevertheless the capacity for the entirety of religion to be labeled as an evil force, I think is relatively new. And whether that's the case or not, the reality is it currently is possibly perceived like that by many people. So I'd like to just say that my understanding about religion in general, and obviously Islam in specific, is that it comes from the word religio, which means to bind. And its primary function is to help human beings discern between the real and the illusory. So between reality and illusion or delusion, and those who study theology know there's, particularly Freud, I think, would know that there's a difference in theology and psychology between the two. But nevertheless, the capacity of distinguishing between what is real and what is not, I think would be safe to say is a generic job description for faiths. And ultimately by doing so, it enables human beings to make that recognition and then equips them with the tools necessary to be able to hold fast and steadfastly to the real. And so, namely, that of course would be a form of detachment, because the illusory can be tempting. And there are times where we know we're chasing illusions, but nevertheless, we go on, because the illusion is nice, it's exciting, it's, sometimes we know we're on ego trips, but nevertheless, the trip is enjoyable. And so it not only gives us the capacity to discern that this is an illusion, but also the capacity to enhance our desire to detach from this illusion and to want the real. That is also specifically a function of religion. And it seeks to, unlike anything else known in the scientific method, religion concerns itself primarily with answering ultimate questions, or what you can call questions of ultimate concern. Again, theists and atheists alike would possibly, for the most part, I think, all agree that there are two great mysteries that human beings are faced with right off the bat, as soon as we can think for ourselves. The first one is where we came from. And that includes from nowhere. That would still be an answer. But, that's the kind of question. So a nihilistic answer would work, where we came from. But also the other question is where we are going. Some like to add a third one that is also a primary function of religion is, okay, so what are we doing here? But I'd like to kind of just leave that for later, or maybe even for another talk. For now, I'm concerned primarily with where we've come from and where we're going. And those present themselves as mysteries. And religion seeks to answer them. Now, the yearning for God, and if I could say also in this context, I could probably say for truth beauty, and justice, namely, which is also God, but I'd like to kind of take away the loaded nature of that term, is something that needs a lot of work. And one of the reasons it needs a lot of work is that we are constantly under the pressure of the ordinary. The ordinary mundane experience tends to really pressure our hearts. And I'd like to read a quick passage from C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, which I found very interesting as a start for this brief journey I'd like to take into the essence of Islam. So he basically is, I don't know if most of you know it or not, but I might just give a quick background. The context is, it's fictitious, and they're basically letters that a senior devil is writing to his nephew, the junior devil. So Screwtape, the big guy, sends Wormwood, the little guy, advice about how to tempt human beings and how to set them astray. So and this is the first letter, this is part of the first letter. And the little tempter, the young Wormwood, apparently took a wrong path, according to his uncle, who's not just his uncle, but also like some big guy in the University of Tempting. Yeah, he's really well connected. And so he says, I'll ask the little devils around you how you've been doing and stuff. It really scares Wormwood. But at one point, Wormwood makes the fatal mistake, satanically speaking, of trying to talk logic to the person, as opposed to just using temptation and lust and all these other things, which are just so much easier, according to Screwtape. So he's like, you're going astray, man. So let me tell you a story. And then Screwtape says to Wormwood, I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. Now, needless to say, obviously, the goal is to keep people in an atheistic framework. And obviously, Screwtape refers to God as the enemy. And the reason he does so is obvious. So just when you hear that. And he says, one day as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow in a moment. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years' work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control, and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. The enemy, presumably, made the counter-suggestion. You know how one can never quite overhear what he says to them. The counter-suggestion that this was more important than lunch. At least I think that must have been the enemy's line, for when I said, quite, in fact, much too important to tackle at the end of a morning, the patient brightened up considerably. And by the time I had added, much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway to the door. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going past. I guess Uni 4 would work better for us. And before he reached the bottom of the steps, I had got into him an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, in quotation marks, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him that all that sort of thing just couldn't be true. He knew he'd had a narrow escape, and in later years was fond of talking about that inarticulate sense for actuality which is our ultimate safeguard against the aberrations of mere logic. He is now safe in our Father's house. Of course, the Father would be Satan, or known in the Muslim tradition as Iblis. And you begin to see the point, he asks. Thanks to processes, now this is an important part, thanks to processes which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar while the familiar is before their eyes. Keep pressing home on him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. We can say theology in general. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been sad cases among the modern physicists. Obviously, he means people who've embraced theism, If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from that invaluable real life. But the best of all is to let him read no science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all, and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the results of modern investigation. Do remember you are there to fuddle him. From the way some of you young fiends talk, anyone would suppose it was our job to teach. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So, I just wanted to highlight the ordinary. The idea that on the one hand, as human beings, the various forces that are interlocking within us can actually vary in their degree of power onto us depending on our spiritual purity. And I'll highlight what spiritual purification means from a Muslim perspective, obviously, in a while. But at the end of the day, as Al-Ghazali has noted, we are constantly under the pressure of, on the one hand, the bestial desires, namely like food and drink, so hunger and thirst. And those are constantly there, and we saw what happened to the man here in this fictitious account. But also the sexual desire. And by sexual desire, we're not constraining this to simply the libido itself and the actual desire, but just the things that we would do to become sexually desirable. So there's an egotistical side to it as well. You know, sometimes the obsession with our outward appearance. I mean, I've seen girls who would stare, in the mirror every chance no one was looking. So technically, they'd want to stare. It happens. I've seen guys do that as well. And so we have these things. And at the same time, those are the bestial kinds. But then you have also the what he calls the satanic desires as well. And those are the love of status and fame, right? The love of being number one. The love of competition for ego-related purposes, the love of fame for what that can bring, and position in people's hearts, as Al-Ghazali refers to it. So that's one satanic desire. And again, that's constantly attacking those of us who qualify for it. Some of us don't, and therefore don't have that problem. You could see that they're just unconcerned with fame or just... I think fame... I focus on fame because that's something I struggle with as someone who is recognized where I come from. But I think that I should also highlight just position and power and just being in charge of something. And then the other satanic one is love of knowledge, but not for spiritual reasons, not for selfless reasons, but to say that I know, right? To be able to say I know, which is another form of position and power. And those are the four desires that, according to Ghazali and many other spiritual writers, would be constantly in competition for our heart's attention and for the inner consciousness to be focused on, and therefore are possibly and almost usually are distracting away from the real desire, which, I was going to get to this later, but since it's come up, might as well continue it, the desire to know truth, the desire to know the truth. And that's a desire within the human being, a desire to answer those two questions that we started speaking about. Where have I come from? Even if it means from nowhere. Nihilism is an option on the menu until one can recognize that it isn't true, if and when they do. And where am I going? Again, even if it means nowhere, my consciousness ceases to exist as soon as I die. And I know the time is so limited, so I don't want to go into the BBC documentary I saw, but where they actually followed people and wanted to see, they actually watched people die, which I think was intrusive and unnecessary, but nevertheless it does poke the curiosity of people big time. And one of the people actually was a nihilist, and it was interesting that that's how he finally, from a religious perspective, it would be that he limited himself to only one aspect of his consciousness, which is a certain sense, a rational sense, but that there was more on the menu that he never even looked at, but was still within man. So religion, to get back on track, is there to awake that sense within the human being that yearns for truth. And it starts by enhancing that yearning. And that's why you don't have to be a theist a priori to start embarking on the spiritual journey. See, because that would be begging the question. That wouldn't work. If you go to someone and say, well, you want to find the truth? Yeah, well, just want God. I don't even know yet. That's what the person would say. But the real answer would be, want to know the truth. And by truth, it's not capital T, though I believe it would be capital T, since I kind of see something of that sort. However, I wouldn't mind having a small t there, because truth is, as someone once put it, whatever really is the case. Whatever it really is. So if the case is that, it's nihilism, fine, and that's the case. But it's interesting to note, and if you read the beginning of the God Delusion, Richard Dawkins very humbly and interestingly says that on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being the perfect believer and 7 being the 100% staunch, ardent atheist who just knows, not just guesses, but knows that there's nothing, he would be a 6 that wants to push towards a 7. You see? So Richard Dawkins himself, and I only cite him, I don't think his arguments are the most impressive at all, but he is the kind of media figure for this thought. So that's why I cite him. But there are some really more interesting atheists, for those who are interested. John Hott wrote about, in his book, God and the New Atheism, he talks about how, real atheism required, you have to get ready to be insane. And Nietzsche, I think, said that. And it's just, it's really hardcore. It's not the whole, the world is great without religion and there's probably no God, enjoy your life, and that's it, with that bus campaign. It's not that simple. I wish it were that easy. At least someone would be able to enjoy life without thinking of those questions. But anyway, so you have this, you can go up to a person and say, truth is whatever really is the case. And the yearning that religion enhances in people is, go find out the truth. Whatever it really is. Just go find it out. Don't give up. Someone once said, and I appreciate there may be agnostics in the room, so this is not in any way to offend them, but I remember someone politely saying that he perceived agnosticism as a celebration of ignorance, which was a form of, an anomaly in human history again. I can see how that, if I was an agnostic, and I've had my skeptical moments, I can see how that would be offensive, so I don't mean to offend anyone. But I want to highlight the other aspect of it, which is that don't accept not knowing. Even if it means living till the very last moment searching, to me that would be, still worthy and in a moral way very chivalrous. And Bertrand Russell is quoted to have said that if God were to, if he met God, he was an atheist. Although his daughter says he always wanted to find the truth, so this might apply to him. But he said that if God were to ask him what happened, he would say, not enough evidence, Your Majesty, which is interesting. So now one more side note here to move on, because I can definitely not get into everything I want to get into here. With this idea of where the evidence leads. Antony Flew, I think, was one of the most influential atheists in the world. And Antony Flew's essay, Theology and Falsification, was really the basis for a lot more atheism and a lot more convincing theological arguments. So this is how powerful he was. And obviously he was an atheist, and he was an intellectual atheist, and someone who really knows his philosophy as well, unlike Dawkins and others who are simply talking from the biological specialized perspective, which is really, you need to know a lot of philosophy to be able to speak. The only atheist that at least knows philosophy that I know of the public figures that is really one of the four horsemen would be Dan Dennett, I think. But so Antony Flew has a chapter in his most recent book, There Is a God, which the title is written in a way where there is no God, and then he crosses the no out and puts an A, and that's indicative of his journey, because he finally came to deism, not really theism, but to deism. So there's some sort of intelligent designer. And he has a beautiful chapter called Where the Evidence Leads. And I really recommend that for those who are interested, because I can't take more time with this. So to conclude this section of the talk, which is about religion in general, I'd like to say that searching is important. And I'd also like to say that we shouldn't, I shouldn't, but I would recommend this to my friends as well. I wouldn't want to take people's word on questions of ultimate concern. I just don't think that's an intelligent thing to do. And, I could take their opinions and cherish them and then go and falsify them myself. I think that would be better. Now, the religious point of view, and then particularly the Islamic point of view, is not one that denounces reason at all. In fact, I would particularly say that the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, can appear so rational to the point that we have these very weird movements coming out, these very weird postmodern Muslim movements that I like to call Bukhailism, that, it came out from Maurice Bucaille, I think. He was the writer of the Bible, the Quran, and Science. And these movements have come up where suddenly the argument for Islam's authenticity is all rational, which was never the case throughout history. And there they are doing the Quran scientifically said this, and this was in the desert, and Bedouins couldn't have known this, and so this must be true. And people like this don't really know anything about falsification. And we shouldn't do that. I personally would say to Muslims, at least, that's a very unhealthy exercise. But nevertheless, for there to be such an exercise within the Muslim world is highly indicative of how rational the Quran can be. And so at the end of the day, the Muslim message or the Quranic message was never denounce reason, but more like recognize the limits of reason. Reason can bring you up to the door of God, but then you must humble yourself to enter. So it will show you the coherence of revelation. It will show you the coherence of theism. It will show you the coherence of belief in an omnipotent God, if that's the one part you're asking about, or in an omnibenevolent God, if Haiti or tsunamis or other things are making you get into the realm of theodicy. Again, it will show you the coherence. It can show you that God is in Haiti, for example, but that would be a whole other topic that I can't address now. And it would give you arguments to make it at least seem coherent. It would do so with the assertion of existence of an intelligent designer. It would come up and say, okay, so scientifically the universe seems fine-tuned for carbon-based matter and life. Well, that's consistent with a deity. I mean, if there was a deity, you'd think that things would go towards the deity's purposes. Otherwise it wouldn't, make sense. But and that's why people shouldn't take these things as arguments for the existence of God, because they can always be answered back at with whenever someone doesn't want to believe in God, for whatever reason it is. There can be an answer. And that's why, with this point about rationalism, I think that believers shouldn't look for compelling arguments. Because I personally don't see it fitting with divine purposes for there to be an argument that you could just say, yeah, atheist? Yeah. How about now? Still an atheist? I don't think that's the way it should have been. I mean, everyone has to make up their minds for themselves. That's why in psychology as well, with the authenticity of religious experience and those who've studied it, I see some of the theology faces here. I mean, religious experience shouldn't be an argument. It just could be like, try it for yourself. And that takes me to the second part. Again, back to Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was, interestingly, the first person who actually used the scientific method and applied it to spirituality. So, because see, the Sufis, which are really the spiritual masters of the Muslim tradition, have always said there are certain things you have to do and undergo for God to reveal Himself. And no masculinity intended there, but just the nature of language, for God or for the deity to reveal itself to you. And those things entail a process of purification. So you want to look at yourself and you want to say, okay, let me be honest right now, I'm just hungry. Or let me be honest right now, sexuality is the thing and I can't deal with the moral restraints of religion. Let's be honest. And promiscuity or whatever, the prohibition of that. Or let me be honest with myself, I want fame, or I want this, or I want that. And honesty is very, very important. And once someone does that and begins to acknowledge the existence of what can be known as ailments of the heart or diseases of the heart, you can start and embark on the journey of purification. And it's through this process that the sages have always called tahalli, takhalli, and tajalli. Tahalli being takhalli first, being the emptying of the human vessel. Right? And I have a quotation here for you. It is by emptying the vessel of his being that man becomes worthy of receiving the message of heaven. So this idea of takhalli, but it also means letting go. It also means being detached. And I find it very interesting that Chris McCandless's story from Into the Wild, the novel, and then, it's a true story as well, and then also the film that Sean Penn made, was made into a film. I was really excited to see that made into a film because it's something that we need, I think, in today's postmodern world. And this, in a nutshell, because of the time, this is a young man who gets sick of the materialistic nature of his life and is very successful and has a lot of money, but decides to just get rid of it all. And he just goes into the wild. And he keeps going from place to place, and he writes diaries, and that's how we know and how we get to write about him and make films about him, until he finds this bus in Alaska where he resides there in the bus and is eating plants, and he has these, Swiss knives and these manuals. And at one point, I think the narrations vary, but he probably got poisoned and then died. but he had something about like, I found happiness, but too bad I had no one to share it with, which kind of shows that, the Muslim standpoint has never been to leave the world with your body, but it has been leave it with your heart. So, but Chris McCandless, I think, did what he could. And he was searching for truth, and he did that, and he left. And Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam wrote a song for the soundtrack. I think he did the whole soundtrack. And one of the most fascinating songs I've ever heard, and particularly from the standpoint of lyrics, was Society in that film. And in Society, basically it starts, well, it's a mystery to me. We have agreed with which we have agreed. And you think you have to want more than you need. Until you have it all, you won't be free. Society, you're a crazy breed. I hope you're not lonely without me. When you want more than you have, you think you need. And when you think more than you want, your thoughts begin to bleed. I think I better find a bigger place, because when you have more than you think, you need more space. Society, you're a crazy breed. Society, have mercy on me. I hope you're not angry if I disagree. And you can see it's an extreme reaction to the less than spiritual condition that I would say sometimes the world is heading towards, evidently. But at the end of the day, what I like about him is that there's a parallel to Al-Ghazali, because Al-Ghazali left his life at one point. He had two crises in his life. The first one was he doubted epistemological assertions. So he was at a point where he didn't even know how you could know, right? And he kind of just said, I don't know anymore. I don't know. And then he took his time and analyzed the limits of reason, the capacities, the various things, comes up with some very fascinating arguments. And then at one point he says, okay, at least I know I can know. Now let's see what there is to be known. And he was sincere enough to do that. And I believe that was pre-Cartesian, I think. I'd have to check. But anyway, and then on the other hand, he becomes the most, eminent scholar of his time, Muslim scholar. And he, in a way, really just unites the Muslim nation. And there was an issue going with authority and stuff. And he really just sets the rules and the agenda for the years to come. But then he goes through another crisis, which, am I sincere? He's become this glamorous scholar. He sits there, thousands of people come from all over the world, and mind you, there was no carbon footprint problem back then, there were no airplanes. Right? People took really heavy journeys, and I'm sure many of them died on their way to his lectures. And there he was, it's like, about 10 minutes from now I'll just walk to the college. It's very, very different. And he doubted his sincerity. The man thought, you know what, I could go to hell, because I believe in God, but at the end of the day, I don't think I'm being sincere. I'm doing this for people. And I wrote a song in light of this. I'll just read you a little bit of the lyrics. It's, you call yourself a fighter, but the name is what you're looking for. You think you're getting lighter, yet love and fame has got you weighing more. The crowd is shouting louder, and the lights are getting bright outside. But your soul, it's getting darker, and your heart, kid, it has lost its light. There's nothing worse than being champ, than forgetting how to play the game. You kill yourself going up a mountain, then forget which way you came. And now that you're on top, it's the lowest that you've ever been. Looks like you got to start over again. And it goes on. But I tried to capture that for my own sake, I guess, with all this public speaking and stuff. And you said 10 minutes remaining, so I guess I'm going to have to begin to wrap up here. So in a sense, reason shows us the coherence, and then And religion is fine with that. Then it says, fine, you're okay, can we move now? And then you say fine, and then it takes you to a new level of consciousness. One in which you can intuit truth and beauty and justice, which you had a hunch that they existed, but couldn't really, and you rationally showed their coherence, but then suddenly, oh, there it is. Okay, now let me actually see it. And so, it's like being blind and suddenly seeing colors. That's the analogy that would be. You wouldn't understand colors prior to getting eyesight, and then this experiential reality is actually a form of knowledge in the Muslim paradigm. It's not experience that can be reduced to a sentimental kind of emotional experience. It's not like that. There necessarily is an emotional filter by being the imperfect emotional beings we are, but that doesn't mean that it's all emotion, and the reductionism here would be unwarranted. So it's a form of knowledge, And Al-Ghazali always held that this type of knowledge, ma'rifah, is really the nutrition for the heart. And obviously the heart being the spiritual insight of man, of human beings. The heart being the capacity of the human being to transcend their bodies and their finite rational reality into something more. So love, that's when love kicks in the Muslim paradigm. Love kicks in when you've made the recognition and you've actually seen truth, beauty, and justice to a point where you don't, it's not, I mean, people can try and falsify it, but you don't mind because you're seeing the color. So interestingly, it goes back to, I mean, spiritual intuition in the Muslim paradigm is a reflection of sensorial intuition and perception, in the sense that you can see, and I mean, you can doubt that this exists, and to a certain level you might be right, and religion might even be with you, calling this a sort of illusion, being what we call a contingent reality. But nevertheless, you will live your life in accordance with the fact that there's something called eyesight and hearing, and you will talk to people, and it's just that kind of comfort zone that you find with your senses is very similar to the one that you find with your spiritual sense once you've gone through the, takhalli, the detachment, and then tahalli, which is the adornment and the beautification, process of having good character and being sincere and abhorring lying, for example, and recognizing that telling a lie is not just reducible to words that were in society, from a societal perspective, agreeable. That there's more of a reality to telling the truth and to misrepresenting reality by lying than reductionists may see. And again, I wouldn't blame them if that was their paradigm. It does make sense. I mean, you can reduce all love to utilitarianism if you want, but those who are in love would lovingly beg to disagree. So yeah, and then what happens basically is then you get to tajalli, where God reveals, the deity reveals itself to you. And then you're intuiting and then you're seeing. Now when you get to the tajalli stage, in the Muslim paradigm, you can't help but love God, or truth, or beauty, or justice, or sovereign goodness, God, all these being the same. You can't help but do that. It's like seeing something beautiful. You don't think about, let me begin to think that sunset was beautiful. You don't go through that process. It's beautiful, and that's only a finite reflection of that kind of intuition and the love that it necessarily entails. To know one's origin is to love it. Rumi is quoted to have said, and he's the great Sufi poet, by the time the intellect, and he means the lower intellect, reason, has found a camel for the Hajj, for the pilgrimage, love has already circled the Kaaba, right? And the Kaaba being obviously where Muslims go for their pilgrimage. The 12-meter high cube that has more than a physical meaning to Muslims. Obviously, it's not just a stone. In fact, this takes me to the last section here, which is outward forms with inner meanings. And I have a quotation here. The Kaaba functions in the imagination of those who visit it on Hajj or turn towards it in prayer. Because see, when Muslims pray, they're actually looking at the Kaaba as well, and they're receiving it. So you either physically go or you at least spiritually go in 5 times a day. It functions as the center and point of origin of all diverse things on earth. It is oriented towards the 4 cardinal points of the compass. Its blackness recalls the blackness of the night sky of the heavens, and hence the pure presence of the Creator. God tells us that there are signs for us in the heavens and the earth, a Quranic verse. And recent astronomy affirms that the spiral galaxies are revolving around black holes, a powerful symbol written into the magnificence of space, of the spiritual vortex, which beckons us to spiral into the unknown, which is what the pilgrims do. In a sense, they're spiraling. Where quantum mechanics fail, he's referring to the black holes again, where time and space are no more. And so there's a parallel between what's happening in nature and what's happening in the human being if they decide to not set aside the question of where have I come from and where am I going, and not settle for agnosticism. The yearning for the Kaaba, which sincere Muslims feel, is a fragment, a breath of the nostalgia for our point of origin, for that glorious time out of time when we were in our Maker's presence, spiritually obviously. And this refers to a Muslim belief that the soul already knows God by virtue of being, period, existing. So I think my time is up. Since the time is up and I'm almost finished, if you give me 3 more minutes to conclude, I'd be very indebted, so at least it's wrapped up properly. I'll take that as a yes. So I just wanted to end with a verse on the one hand, which is, and then a quick word about the Prophet, without whom none of this would have been possible for Muslims. And so you save the best for last, really. The verse is obviously in Surah 3, Al-Imran, it's verse 190 and 191. Truly in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the succession of night and day are signs for people of inner understanding, higher intellect. Those who recall Allah, God, standing and sitting and reclining on their sides, and ponder or think about the way in which the heavens and the earth have been made. So looking for things like spiraling galaxies and meanings. And obviously using that sense within them to intuit higher meanings in what otherwise would be the prison of physicality or physical. My timer is saying I'm done. So thank you, iPhone. You know the iPhone that saved the guy in the earthquake? iPhones are just becoming really, really powerful. And then what we become when we embody this verse, and the narration of this verse when it was revealed to the Prophet, is that he couldn't stop crying until Bilal, who was the person who called to prayer, would do so from the Prophet's house, because that's where the mosque was, went there, and it's right before the break of dawn and the morning prayer, and he goes to, the Prophet finds him crying, and he says, "Why are you crying so much?" And he says that this verse was revealed upon me, and it's just, that's what it did to me. And what I see human beings as here is, as a Christian theologian recently said, we're really the conscious relationship of the cosmos to its creator. We're the universe finally being able to speak to its maker. So there's an evolution that we go through until human beings exist, and then these human beings, their consciousness can evolve, not physically, because they're upright and they are the cross, the meeting point right now between heaven and earth. That's why we have the straight back symbolically, but they have an evolution of consciousness. And what happens is it can finally affirm the names of God once more and see God in spite of, suffering in nature or apparent waste or whatever else people will throw at us, but never actually take the rest of the journey with us to answer back. And so the conclusion about the Prophet ﷺ is that, people who believe this are really embodying in this comprehensiveness, meaning that the spiritual aspects, but also the physical aspects of Islam, and even when they do physically pray, they're thinking of that symbolic meaning of the Kaaba as well. So they're an embodiment of outward and inward truth. They would fit into the hadith or the prophetic tradition in which he says, in essence, I have been sent by God to perfect the traits of noble character. They become saints or approximations, depending on how much of this they've done, and they start to reflect the light of God through character, not through rational discourse. They will show you the coherence if you're open to see it, but it's really about their character. That's what makes them beacons of divine light on earth. And that's why when they asked me about this talk, they took a quote from a talk I'd given in Abu Dhabi, where after the Danish cartoon incident, there was a lot of anger from some very immature Muslims. And don't get me wrong, there can be an internal anger at the fact that people are, they're not intellectually talking to you, but they're making fun of you, being satirical. That's not nice. But see, the saintly type of person would have that anger internally, but it would only mobilize more spirituality in their dealing with everyone else. Like Imam al-Shafi'i is reported to have said, the Safih, so these people with no intellect, talk to me, and they say, all these offensive things, and I'm like incense. The more you burn me, the more I'm fragrant. And so they keep going at him. He's like a bee, takes all these things in and brings out honey, just keeps out bringing out. So there was the immature reaction, which I kind of contradistinguish between the internal anger that one can have, right? But also, more importantly, the internal anger at oneself for not representing the Prophet properly and allowing for someone to be able to draw a turban as a bomb. I mean, where did that cartoonist get that thought from? From terrorism. So, I mean, you've given him content, not you, but people who follow your same path, and so, or at least claim to. And so what happened is, there was that response, and so some of us got together and decided to show another Muslim response, a more mature one. And we got together, 25 Arab Muslims and 25 non-Muslim Danes, because they can be Danish Muslims, but non-Muslim Danes. And we were in a room for 3 days in this conference room, and it started out really heated, and we had fronts. Everyone had their front, their personality, their persona, the mask. It's sacred to me to be able to, speak freely. Well, it's sacred for me to love the Prophet. And that was the first day, right? Everyone went to sleep, came up. Second day, a little cooler, things were better. By the third day, people were crying. We were saying goodbye, and we all realized that it was all semantics. And so what happened was, in the talk I gave, I think I referred to there being, our numerators are different, or I think I said we all have a common denominator, our numerators are different, that's all. So if you're wondering what you read on the pamphlet, that was the context of it. So I can't get into more ta'aruf or things about the commonality between human beings anymore, but I will say that if piety and God consciousness were the reality based upon which we would judge each other, if judging is even necessary, and I think it isn't, then we would be a lot less judgmental, and there would be a lot more respect in the world, and there'd be a lot more there'd be peaceful coexistence, because everybody is wondering about how am I going to answer this ultimate question, and there isn't time for these petty personality.
All right, thank you very much.